Today we are interviewing Mary Kathleen Price, who is Professor of Law Emeritus at the University of Florida, where she also served from 2003 until her retirement in 2010 as Associate Dean, Library and Technology, and Clarence J. Tissell Professor of Law. Kathy, as Kathleen is more commonly called, you had a long and very distinguished career before coming to Florida. Your prior positions, among others, include as Professor of Law and Law Library Director at New York University. You were the Law Librarian of Congress for a while, and you were Professor of Law and Director of the Law Library at the University of Minnesota. And I remembered that while you were at Minnesota, you were involved in the central administration of the university for a while as acting Vice President for Academic Affairs. I know you had other jobs in your career, and we can talk about those in a few moments, but I thought before we do, I'd like to ask you a little about your own personal history, what your life was like when you were young, and perhaps what it's like today.
Well, thank you very much, Pat. I'm very pleased to be here today and to be speaking to you because, as you say, my career was long and varied. I guess I have a reputation among law librarians as being unable to keep a job because I had the good fortune to serve as the library director and a professor of law at a number of institutions. I actually began life, as did a number of other well-known law librarians in Buffalo, New York. My family moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida when I was very young, and I attended the University of Florida on a teaching scholarship that required I pay back the money with a year of teaching for every year that I took it. That turned out to be a very good thing for me because while I was at Florida, I became aware of Betty Taylor, who many of your participants will know as being the long-term law library director at the University of Florida. She was well known even in those days, in the 1960s, because she had worked her way through law school over a period of 10 years. So I realized that it was possible for me to do the same thing. And while I was teaching in Jacksonville, Florida, and Titusville, I began taking extension courses in librarianship from Florida State University. I finished up my library degree in 1967, which seems 100 years ago, as on an Office of Education fellowship, and took my first library position at the University of Alabama. Some of the people who know legal education well will know that that is a faculty that has had quite a bit of turmoil and at least two faculty revolutions. I was caught up in the first of those, and with everybody who had been brought in by Dan Metter, I left for the University of Illinois in 1970. By that time, I had completed half of my law degree at 2 courses a semester. At the University of Illinois, I served as associate law librarian, finished my degree so that when I graduated after 6 years in 1973, I was the associate director, making more money at that time, unbelievably, at $15,000 a year than young law associates, and ready to go to work as an associate at Ross Hardy's, O'Keefe, Babcock, and Parsons. This was the period of time when law firms would say to you quite openly as you interviewed that they already had a woman or a woman partner, and they certainly didn't need a second. So I was fortunate to go to this very liberal democratic firm as their first woman, and was quickly joined thereafter by another number of very talented people. I'd been quite honest with them when I interviewed, and I told them that I really thought I was interested in a career in academic life, and the senior partners assured me that they would try to make the law firm inviting, but they would certainly understand if I decided to move on. So after 2 years, I accepted a position at Duke University. It was a wonderful period for me. I have been fortunate in having 3 of the very best positions in law librarianship at Duke, the University of Minnesota, and the University of Florida, largely because the 3 deans in those institutions were so supportive of the law library, and because they made it clear to me and to the rest of the faculty that it was important for the law library director to participate in the law faculty. Mm-hmm. Ken Pye chose criminal law as the course that I would teach, and in addition to teaching that course and directing the law library, I also taught legal research to the 17 to 20 students in my small section. Mm-hmm. I left after 5 years for the University of Minnesota as George Grossman moved on, and had a wonderful 10 years in that institution. My dean, Ken Pye, who I have to say is to this day the person that I consider to be my mentor, had told us 2 things: that we must participate in activities beyond the law school, and that we needed really also to be very active in international affairs. And when I went to Minnesota, he informed his good friend, who was the president of the university, that I should be involved in international activities. They were planning a trip to China because it had recently opened up in 1980, and I was part of a delegation of 12 faculty members. Over the next 20 years, my life was intimately wrapped up in a Ford Foundation project that went by the name the Committee on Continuing Legal Education with China, and its purpose was to rebuild Chinese law schools. When we arrived, there were 7 schools. When we left, virtually every university in China had a law school, mm-hmm. despite the fact that the Ministry of Education had told us that they were not going to become like the United States, a nation of lawyers. There were actually 3 librarians who were part of that project: Bob Baring at Berkeley, Jim Hoover at Columbia, and me. Jerry DuPont from Law Library Microforms Consortium was also very active and worked with us to see that the participating key universities and the Academy of Social Science received microforms of their publications. And together we traveled to China. We put on annual legal research institutes, and we were also responsible for identifying Chinese law librarians who would become part of a very active professional community. And you can imagine how thrilled I am all of these years later that that community has come into its own, and there's a very active program of institutes and various activities between Chinese and American law librarians. Mm-hmm. So I guess I would have to say that I consider that Chinese experience to be one of the contributions that I'm proudest of. I'm also very proud of the fact that throughout my career I've attempted to repay the work of the people who mentored me early on in my career, people especially like Mike Jacobstein and Morris Cohen, and to help to develop the next generation of law library directors. There were a number of people who've worked for me who've gone on to directorships. from Duke, Barbara Gontram, Dick Danner, Claire Germain, Marion Parker, Faye Jones. From Minnesota, Gail Daly, Phyllis Marion, Suzanne Thorpe, of course, could have, but has remained loyal to Minnesota, but also Marianne Nelson and Marcia Baum. And then, of course, from NYU, Radu Papa. So I feel particularly fortunate that I've worked with all of these wonderful people over the years. I probably would have stayed at Minnesota for my entire life had I not gone off on our exchange program to Uppsala, Sweden. And while I was gone and separated from my peers, I was approached by the Law Library of Congress to become its director. This was a period of great turmoil in the Library of Congress as a whole. Director Billington had recently come to the library. There was a great deal of controversy as he brought in an accountant who essentially reorganized the entire system. And one of the things they attempted to do, as they did periodically, was abolish the Law Library of Congress. Carlton Kenyon had retired after many years as the director, and so the library appeared to be very vulnerable. The first 6 months that I was there, I was tasked in library military jargon to justify the existence of the law library, which I evidently successfully did, although I cannot say that the period that I served there was one of tranquility. And I think this is probably one of the lessons that I have learned that I hope to impart to people who are coming along in the profession, and that is that it's extremely difficult to be a change agent after the long-term directorship of another, because of course one of the problems that you have is that people have grown a little bit passive as they've attempted to perform their duties, and the administration applies pressure for you to make major changes. So you can expect that your tenure will be brief and that it may be stormy. And indeed, when I left the law library, I left as part of a suit brought by one of our foreign legal specialists that continued for another 5 years. So this is sort of a lesson for people who work for the government. It is a tenuous existence at best. And of course, in these times when government officials and civil servants are under attack, made even more difficult than it was at that time. And I have to admit that one of the reasons I left was because the opportunity to be the global law librarian at NYU was so attractive and came with a book budget that was larger than the Law Library of Congress's. But the law library experience was really a wonderful one because this was an institution that had been inward looking for so many years. And except for the chief of the European Law Division, the staff really had no opportunity to travel or to participate in a variety of international events, despite the fact that their principal obligation was to provide foreign, international, and a comparative legal information to Congress and other government agencies, especially the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The one thing I learned to my delight was that if the Library of Congress issued an invitation to international libraries, they would come and they'd do it on their own ticket. So we reached out to the libraries of the Council of Europe and the European communities. We became very active. We started a publication program that resulted in 2 very useful books. We were in the process of beginning Glynn, which over time, I think, became less useful than our initial hopes for it, largely because there was a great deal of resistance in the private sector to the law library being able to create a project that was in a final sophisticated form and sell that to recoup funds for other activities. I was fortunate enough to be there at the time that the Soviet Union fell, and to witness things such as, for example, the ex-Queen of Romania showing up regularly to consult with our Romanian legal specialist, our Syrian specialist sitting and translating day in and day out for the Department of Defense. Just a variety of activities that really put us in the forefront of projects to globalize librarianship. We were constantly briefing judges who were off to a variety of Eastern European countries to train judges and lawyers. And this really harkened back to the law library's initial days, when even the foreign ministers of Eastern European countries after the war spent time as part of the research team at the Library of Congress. Over time, the CIA used it as a dumping ground for people who'd worn out their welcome as spies. And so the linkage between the usefulness of the people involved with giving information and the users was less valuable than at the beginning. But I still have high hopes over time that the law library will become the National Legal Information Network that we all dreamed about, and that it will have the place that it deserves, because I can attest that the collection there is the finest in the world, not only in foreign and international materials, but also in rare books, which are largely uncatalogued. And of course, my colleague Yolanda Goldberg, who to this day remains one of my best friends, is responsible for making those materials accessible to the public and the scholarly community. I played a small part because with Yolanda, we worked on the creation and the selling to the political science community of JX and KX as parallel legal systems. And of course, that same kind of system has been found over time as we've worked on religious law of various kinds and broken it away from the plain religion categories. I actually was able to build on my earlier experience because it may be a surprise to some people who are young in the profession now, but back in the 1960s, when we graduated from library school, the men would move on to become directors of libraries, and the women would become catalogers. So at Alabama, I worked first as a cataloger, then an acquisitions librarian, then a documents librarian, and then finally the epitome to be a reference librarian. Harvard had reference librarians on the floor at that time, but very few law libraries did. And when you think of how important the reference staff is today as part of the teaching faculty of university law libraries, this has been a major and a very welcome change. And of course, one that proved also to be important at NYU and at the University of Florida, where I then went on after NYU. NYU was to some extent a difficult place to be because, of course, the dean, now president of the university, declared quite openly that his predecessor had been a dean for libraries, but he was not going to be. So this notion of justifying our decisions was again, a major portion of the job that had to be done there. But we taught research in the library school. We really had a very fine program with the graduate students at NYU. And you know, you cannot imagine how exciting it is to be at an NYU or a Yale or a Columbia. These are not extremely large law schools in terms of their undergraduate programs, but at NYU we had 400 foreign and international students on really major scholarships, and the interchange that we had with them, as well as the programs for them that were presented by our faculty members who had been major players at the UN and other international organizations, made it such an exciting place to be. We had Hillary Clinton and Tony Blair and a variety of constitutional courts in residence at one time or another at NYU. So the educational program was really first rate, and of course I certainly can understand why the graduates of these very fine law schools have become so important in the life of the law in New York and the other major cities. And of course the difference at NYU, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, Harvard, is that those people were also important in the foreign and international law firms. I maintained my interest in China at NYU and took on the role of consultant to the Tsinghua Law School, and interestingly enough, became an architectural consultant as they planned their new building. For those of you who aren't familiar with Tsinghua, it is the MIT of China, and has the added luster of having graduated most of the important political leaders in the country. So as you might imagine, when they reopened their law school after it had been closed since the 1949 split of law schools into general universities and technological universities, they started out in a position of real strength. I cannot say that the law school looks exactly as it had in my imagination, but Tsinghua is in the process of building a new law school, and its faculty is already internationally known, and really very important not only in the Chinese legal scheme, but also internationally. And to have the opportunity to reconnect with those people over time at such things as this month's American Law Institute meeting here in Washington is a real pleasure. I retired from the University of Florida, where I went to a chair after 10 years at NYU in 2010, and I returned to Washington because, of course, anybody who's ever lived in Washington doesn't really seem to be able to keep away, largely, of course, because there's so much free culture in this city. When I lived here in Tacoma Park back in the 1990s, it used to be said that Washington was a city of northern charm and southern efficiency. And just the opposite is true today. That not only are there marvelous museums and theater, but also, for the first time, terrific restaurants. So living here has been a real pleasure. I have divided my time between the Frank Lloyd Wright House, the Pope Leahy House, and the National Building Museum, because having taught art law and cultural property at the University of Florida, I have come to really appreciate architecture and design in a way that I hadn't early on when my teaching assignments were criminal law, torts, biomedical ethics, and not nearly as well received among students as the more fine arts curriculum. And of course, one of the reasons that those are so well received is nobody has an expectation of a job in those fields. But what you see is that as a lawyer, just as Ken Pye told me at the very beginning, you have to move on beyond the law school or the legal profession and take your responsibility as an attorney in the wider life of a community. And that's just sort of a brief rundown of, I hate to tell you how many years of professional life, but starting in 1967 and continuing to the present day.
Well, it sounds like you've had a fascinating and actually a wonderful career. As you said earlier on, you're sort of a job hopper of sorts. Well, that's not at all true. I mean, 10 years here, 5 years there isn't exactly that. You went with specific assignments, in effect. Some were more pleasurable than others.
Right.
You know, some of the changes you had to make at the Library of Congress and other places were perhaps more stressful under Dr. Billington's leadership. But it sounds like you've had a fascinating and pretty diverse career, Kathy, and in your opportunities in China. I mean, just as that began to develop in a much more of an outreach kind of way, the country did, to today what it is. I mean, you were on the ground floor on a lot of this.
I was in the ground floor on a lot of that, and at Florida, I had the opportunity to be on the ground floor in South Africa, because, of course, that also is a country that is developing and that has high hopes for improving the life of its people.
Yeah.
I served as the director of our summer school program at the University of Cape Town, which gave me an opportunity to look at yet another developing culture and to participate in the change, and to also look at a country that in many ways, I'm afraid, has become, like China, less interesting over time, because one of the things I think that you see as you work in developing countries is that there's so much of a rich cultural life that occurs when the people in a country have very little, but they share it all, and they have a great sense of their culture and their literature, their music, all of the things beyond work that makes life really worthwhile. So, you know, I've seen the bitter and the sweet in those two cultures. I've also taught in Poland and in Sweden, and had opportunities there, and really value that international experience. And of course, in retirement, I'm trying to fill in the gaps and go to the countries in between the countries that I know well. So, you know, I recently was told about something called the Century 100 Travel Club. And as of this fall, I will have been to 82 countries. So I'm attempting to fill out that 100, and also at the same time to go back to those places that I've really enjoyed over the years.
Well, one sort of gets a sense with all these accomplishments that somehow you must have been very busy indeed, and you know, you're really talking about more than a full-time job, just doing all the sorts of things you've talked about. And yet you've spent a lot of time in professional association sorts of activities too. Major accomplishments there. You were, chaired lots of committees. You were program chair of the 1979 annual meeting, and those are in the days when the program chair did it all, because we didn't have all these people at headquarters who were tasked to assist in structuring these programs. And you've received a fair amount of acknowledgement for this in the form of the Frederick Charles Hicks Award for outstanding contributions to academic law librarianship, and the Marion Gould Gallagher Distinguished Service Award, which is the association's highest recognition of people who've done a lot of things for it. And you're also, of course, a member of ALL's Hall of Fame. These all put you in not only a small group in terms of numbers, but among people like yourself who have done a great deal to assist the profession itself, over and above what you do in your regular work. These are professional activities outside of the law school or the university communities themselves. And so I want to sort of ask you if there's anything in this realm that you'd like to talk about, or maybe also comment about your views on this sort of professional activities by our younger colleagues and the importance of such things and benefits.
Well, you wouldn't be surprised to learn that I think that these activities are really important. Mm-hmm. And they add a richness to the job that really makes it so much more interesting. I started out being active in the association when I was a young librarian at the University of Alabama, and the AALL annual meeting was the biggest thing in my life. It was like a week-long senior prom. I still remember my very first meeting in Philadelphia when Earl Borgeson, who was the director at Harvard, became president and refused to appoint new people to committees. And young Morris Cohen, who was later to succeed him at Harvard, Peyton Neal, and Leah Channon, who was also new to the profession, and a number of us sort of took to the ramparts and demanded that we be allowed to participate. At that meeting, I was fortunate enough to be taken under the wing of Harry Bittner from Cornell, who introduced me to everybody at the meeting. We talk about the San Francisco meeting that I program chaired. People forget that back in those days, we didn't have all of the activities that we have at our meetings. There was only one meeting at a time, and the entire association went to it. But the entire association attendance at an annual meeting was probably less than 1,000, mm-hmm. and everybody knew everybody else. It was a wonderful time. I can remember, for example, when we went to the Fontainebleau at a time when the Cuban librarians in Florida were a very active part of the association, and they had conga lines in the evenings. We had sing-alongs at Hine and Rothman and Oceana. To be a very small association meant that you really felt physically connected. And I think it made it a lot easier for those of us who were interested in working for the profession to have a number of opportunities that it's more difficult to break into today. With Mary Oliver and Jane Hammond, for example, were the first two law librarians on the Association of American Law Schools Executive Board. Mm-hmm. I followed them. Bob Baring followed me. That was very unusual mm-hmm. in those days, and now nobody would think a thing of it as we see the people moving into the chair position, for example, at the ABA section of legal education. So, I think that some of us thought of ourselves as pioneers, and maybe we were, but hopefully those who followed us have found the path a little bit easier. I was also early on active in the International Association of Law Libraries at a time when that association had its bylaws written in such a way that 5 members had all of the money and all of the perks of the association. And I can remember supporting Larry Wenger as he attempted to open up that association, which has become in many ways what AALL was to me at the very beginning. It's small. Everybody knows everybody else. There's this sense of volunteerism and working for the association. I'm told that Byall has that same sort of a feeling. And I know from participating several times that the Australian Association also has that wonderful closeness and sense of volunteerism. I was fortunate because of one of my mentors, Julius Mark at NYU, to have an opportunity to serve on the board of the Index to Legal Periodicals and to assume the chairmanship of that board upon Julius's retirement. And this also gives me an opportunity, I think, to say something about the people who've mentored me over the years and also gotten out of the way at appropriate times. For most of my career, I think I've been seen as a transition person who helped to make the difficult move from one director to another. And oftentimes I've found the former director or the senior management hanging around. I decided that I would not do that to Claire Germain, who had been on my staff at Duke and who followed me at Florida, but essentially would get out of Dodge. Because there are very few people like Julius Mark who have the generosity of spirit to open up an entire city and the facilities of the library community there to a successor and to really launch them as he did for me and for Blair Kaufman, who came to Yale at the same time to follow Diana Vincent Davies. And you know, this is so typical of Julius. I have never met a librarian who loved his institution more, who stayed there longer, who went on then to serve as the director of yet another institution, but to always be available only when he was called. And I hope I can live up to Julius's example.
Well, I share your view in that when you've been a long time leader in a place, be it a director or almost any other major role, and it's time to move on to other people moving into that role, it's good to withdraw and let them it's their watch now, not yours. And I've tried to do the same thing here in America, where we are today, doing this interview. And Billy Joe's now been here 10 years, which is a third of the time I was here. And, you know, she and I get along, so I'm hopeful I've done the right thing and left her to, it's her library and it's her directorship, not a continuation of mine. And I share your sentiments and views completely. And as you say, Julius sounds like a 1 in a million to be able to stick around, but not stick around in the wrong sense.
He is a wonderful person, and I think Mike Jacobstein at Stanford has a similar feeling of affection among his staff. And of course, he was the president when I was the program chair for San Francisco, so that relationship was one that was so valuable to me, because, you know, I think there also is a very great difference between those library directors who are in communities by themselves and those who are in the midst of other colleagues.
Mhm.
And it's more difficult to establish those mentorship relationships when you're isolated and you value them so much
Mhm.
because you need that assistance.
A few minutes ago, Kathy, I was mentioning sort of introduction to this part about some of the acknowledgments that you have received for your tremendous contributions. I did not mention, and want to now, that you were also president of ALL, a very successful president in that sense. And, you know, I don't want to let that go unmentioned since neither one of us had.
Well, I was president, as a matter of fact, in 1984,
Mhm.
which gave us an opportunity to use as our convention slogan, "The future is now," which now
That's
has
right.
become quite overused over time. But our convention was in San Diego with Penny Hazelton as the program director. And, you know, to be in San Diego, of course, puts everybody in a fabulous mood. So
The weather was fantastic, the whole
hotel
experience.
was great.
My family came out there. It's the first time we'd ever done this. The kids were in their early teens, and so we all came out and made a family vacation around the convention. It was not only a good first-class convention, but it was also a damn fine
Well,
opportunity for a vacation.
In those days, too, you remember that people did make the convention their family vacation
Yes.
for the year.
Yes.
And they often were held over 4th of July.
Yes,
Which was
that
really
one was, in
a
fact.
wonderful
Yeah.
time because it allowed you to be able to do that.
Yes.
And, you know, I wish the association would go back to that timing. I realize, of course, that one of the changes in the profession over time is that the law firm sector has become much more influential within the association, and we really must accommodate their schedule.
Mhm.
But, you know, I still look with great nostalgia upon those earlier days.
Yeah. Well, you know, we have something in common. Your first annual convention was in Philadelphia in 1968, as I recall. That was my first year as well. And I remember you said it was probably less than 1,000. Actually, I can remember it was like 480.
Well,
And the reason I know that is the following year, the convention was in Houston, Texas, and I was the assistant law librarian there. And there were basically 4 or 5 of us in the city to put on the annual meeting. Al Coco was our chair. And so, you know, Earl Borgeson as president wasn't particularly into appointing new, unknown junior colleagues to things. But in my case, I was appointed because I was so few of us back to handle that meeting. So I sort of lucked out, and I was on an opportunity to be in a major role early on as one of the few people in that city that put on that meeting.
But do you remember how revolutionary the University of Houston was at the time?
Yes.
As I recall, there was a sense that it was really just one spoke on a wheel of multiple institutions,
Yep.
and the others
Yes.
didn't materialize. But
Well,
there was just
one of them
this-
did,
just-
actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but there was still this wonderful sense
Yeah.
of a growing profession.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us who came into it in the late 60s and early 70s were fortunate because we got a great deal of responsibility very young.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful jobs, and of course then we held on to them longer than our successors might have wanted. But I think because we had those long careers, it really gave us an opportunity to have a major impact
Mhm.
on the growth of law librarianship and to become really significant players in the entire legal education framework. And of course, one of the things that we've seen change over time is that so many of us were encouraged to teach substantive law in those
Yes.
years.
Yeah.
And that hasn't always been possible with the next generation. So, and of course, the next generation we now discover are not JDs. They have law degrees and masters in law and PhDs in some subject discipline. But I think one of the ways that the profession, as we first entered it with Superior, was that we were all committed to the profession. And I think what we've seen over time, and I've been reading that there's a backlash brewing to it, and I hope that occurs, is that faculties over time probably were more interested in those PhD subjects that they had, and they wanted to have a European-style graduate school rather than a professional school. And it may have been that if we had kept to our professional roots, that the kinds of skills training that we proposed and were so good at would have been more important over time. So now we're seeing the profession clamoring for the kind of practical experience that we can give to law school graduates.
I see that with my successors here at American. And many of them were actually librarians here when I was director, but the role they play now has evolved, become a lot more hands-on with classroom work and working on with students from a pedagogical standpoint, as opposed to purely just a library reference support type standpoint. And I think it's beneficial.
Well, and I think one of the things that happened as the electronic resources became more important is that the emphasis on legal research diminished, and that law schools have now realized what a terrible mistake that was. And we're seeing our reference staffs become intimately involved in teaching,
Yes.
And moving more and more into the first year, which had been ceded to legal writing professions, who did not handle the research skills well, if they handled them at all. So I think these are really exciting times for our staffs, and they're inclined to think of themselves more as teachers than as more passive participants in waiting for people to bring them questions. I am sorry, however, to see that there's less emphasis on the technical side of librarianship, because I think we're going to come to rue the day when library schools stopped emphasizing cataloging and the organization of information, because that's just as important in an electronic context as it ever was with books.
I think probably more so, because the universe with which you're dealing is so much broader, and it requires the kind of organizational skills that you and I learned in library school, and that
Exactly.
hopefully some of the schools are still imparting to their students, because I think that's what's going to be necessary.
I think what we're seeing is so much of an information overload that people no longer understand how to prioritize information and how to work toward knowledge instead of information as the goal.
We began a few moments ago mentioning that the role of librarians in some ways perhaps has moved a little bit out of the library itself and more into the curriculum or the teaching end. Scholarship expectations seem to have changed a little bit too, at least from what I'm hearing anecdotally, in that in our day, we did scholarly work. You did it, I did it, anybody pretty much in the academic part of our profession did. But now the expectation seems to be being a little more focused on that. I think here at American University, from what I understand, the current provost is much more keen on evaluating writings by librarians who are tenure-track faculty members here than what his predecessors were. And do you have any thoughts about some of that? You did a lot of, in your role at Minnesota and even others, you must have had to evaluate the scholarship end of a lot of the applications that you processed for tenure and that sort of thing.
But things changed at Minnesota. They moved away from librarians as regular faculty to titles that had to do with curator, archivist, those sorts of things, and to judging people based upon how well they did their jobs. Florida was quite different. Florida is the only state university in the system where librarians have tenure, and they're evaluated, as are the teaching faculty and the research faculty in all of the disciplines, from liberal arts to agriculture to medicine. It really has been a tremendous pressure on library staffs to be able to both do their regular jobs and the scholarship on top of it. When I was at the University of Illinois, which at the time was, I believe, the largest state university library in the country, the expectation was that librarians would have 1 day a week to work on their own personal writing.
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen that at any of the other institutions where I've worked, and people have had to perform their scholarship on their own time. That's fine for those who are inclined in that direction. But one of the things I liked about the system at NYU was that they had both a professional track or a specialist track that didn't require scholarship, and then the regular teaching track for those who did.
Mm-hmm.
And this seemed to recognize that people had different strengths and different professional obligations. At Minnesota, as they made the transition from faculty status to a professional status, they only allowed the best of the librarians to make the change, which seems sort of upside down from the way that the professions are usually constructed. But it also, I think, over time has given them a very good professional cadre.
Well, that is so important in any organization, as you and I both, from our experience, well know. As we near the end of this interview, Kathy, is there anything that you want to say that we haven't covered? It's sort of customary to give what I call the last word, the person being interviewed. Try and behave myself and not jump in and add something after that.
Well, I think one of the things that I would like to recommend to young people coming along, is that they develop a passion, and that they not only work to further that passion, but that they make sure that they follow through with a written record. In my early days, when I taught criminal law and torts, I did it from the book. I had no professional experience. There was nothing that I could impart to others. And I've seen some of our colleagues who have become the national experts in different aspects of copyright law, for example. There now is a movement among law librarians to move in a big way into art law, which is just naturally so akin to the profession that it makes it possible to make a contribution, to participate in the professional organizations around the subject, that it really involves a career that's so much more rewarding. I also recommend to people that they become involved in international law. I've found the American Society of International Law to be the most valuable of all of the organizations that I belong to, and that includes ALI and the American Constitutional Society, because that again is an association that has been very generous in recognizing the qualifications of law librarians and the kinds of support that we can give as members of research teams. And as the world becomes more global, of course, the opportunities exist to also be interested in a particular part of the world and to assist in the development of not only the legal system but also the cultural system of some other jurisdiction. And I am constantly grateful for the wonderful opportunities that I've had and hopeful that the next generations of law librarians have the same opportunities and even more and better ones. And I look forward to hearing great things of all of our young librarians and the maturing of the profession.
Good. Well, I think on that note, I want to thank you, Kathy Price, for speaking with us this afternoon and for giving us so much of your own background and experiences and sharing a lot of that. And I think on that note, I will conclude this interview.
Thank you. We of course all build on the shoulders of our forebears, and I hope our shoulders are broad enough to carry along our successors.